In this video, we'll learn about the composition of carbohydrates, one of the main nutrients for energy that we use. We'll learn about the structure, the chemical structure of basic carbohydrates, known as monosaccharides. We'll learn how they combine to form disaccharides and further combine to form polysaccharides. Carbohydrates are made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and they're in a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. So for every carbon atom, there is 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom. So if we're talking about glucose, the chemical formula would be C6H12O6. If it were a 3-carbon sugar, it would be C3H6O3, and so on. Carbohydrates are produced by plants through the process known as photosynthesis, which you will have been made familiar with over your years of school. One thing to note about carbohydrates is that they often end in OSE, so the suffix "ose" refers to a sugar, so glucose, fructose, sucrose are all examples of carbohydrates. And they can exist, as I mentioned before, as monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides, and the word saccharide is Greek for sugar. Monosaccharides are simplest sugars because they are just one carbohydrate molecule. So mono means one, saccharide means sugar. Some common monosaccharides to be familiar with would be glucose. And glucose is the primary energy source for all cells. And we'll spend a lot of time talking about glucose in our cellular respiration and photosynthesis unit because we're going to look at the pathway of glucose to produce energy, and then also how plants use carbon dioxide and water and the sun's energy to produce glucose. Fructose is a fruit sugar, and it's found in fruits, and it's a lot sweeter than glucose, and that's why fruits tend to be sweet. Galactose is a sugar that is found in milk, and we'll learn about that a little bit more when we learn about disaccharides. And finally, deoxyribose. We don't tend to think of it as an energy source sugar. Instead, it's found in DNA. It's the sugar that forms the sugar phosphate backbone in DNA molecules. Monosaccharides are a single carbon chain with hydroxyl groups on every carbon except for one. And the arrangement of the oxygen groups, or the OH groups, will help us identify what sugar it is. And one of the carbons, the one that doesn't have a hydroxyl, has a carbonyl attached to it instead. And where the carbonyl is tells us the type of sugar it is. So aldoses, the carbonyl is on the first carbon. So if you remember from grade 12 chemistry, aldehydes are molecules that have a carbonyl on the very first carbon, and then ketoses, the carbonyl is on the second carbon, and ketoses are similar to ketones. A term that may or may not be familiar to you is the term isomer, and isomers are molecules that have the same molecular formula, so C6H12O6, but they have different arrangements of their atoms. So if you look at these 3 examples, glucose, galactose, and fructose, if you counted up the carbons, the hydrogens, and the oxygens, they are all C6H12O6. But as you can see, they do look different from one another. Now, glucose and galactose don't look all that different. The only difference is this position right here. On this carbon, there's a hydrogen, and on this one, the hydroxyl group points up. That's the only difference between glucose and galactose. But fructose is very different. It has a very different structure, but all of them are considered isomers because they have the same molecular formula. But as you can see, they have different arrangements of their atoms, and those arrangements give them different properties. That's why fructose is sweeter than the other 2 molecules. Now, if you were to look at these 2 molecules, they look extremely similar too, but these ones aren't isomers because they do not have the same molecular formula. Deoxyribose is actually named so because it's missing an oxygen on this carbon. So this should be a hydroxyl, and it's just a hydrogen. Whereas over here on ribose, it is a hydroxyl. So these are not isomers because they do not have the same molecular formula. Disaccharides are 2 monosaccharides that have been joined together. So di meaning 2, so 2 sugars. They're made through the process of condensation reactions. So one of the monosaccharides loses a hydrogen atom, and one loses a hydroxide ion, and those two sections will be attracted to one another, so you get a disaccharide and a leftover water molecule. So they're considered condensation reactions because there is some condensation. You're condensing the molecules, but there's also water or condensation produced. The other name for this process is sometimes referred to as dehydration synthesis. So you're dehydrating the molecule, you're removing water to synthesize two molecules coming together. Now the opposite of this reaction, so splitting a disaccharide, is called hydrolysis. So hydro, water, and lysis means splitting. So to be able to split this molecule here, you would have to add water across this bond, and then you would get your original two monosaccharides together. 3 examples of disaccharides are maltose, which are 2 glucose combined together, and maltose is found in grains and also in beer. Sucrose is a glucose and a fructose combined together, and these sugars are found in table sugars. So good sources of sucrose would be beetroots and other root vegetables. And lactose is the third one, and that's a glucose and a galactose joined together, and that's a milk sugar. And for those people that are lactose intolerant, they don't produce the enzyme that's able to break lactose down. So they end up with some intestinal discomfort whenever they eat something containing lactose. Polysaccharides are complex carbohydrates. So poly meaning many, and saccharide meaning sugar. So these molecules are several hundred to several thousand monosaccharides long. And some examples that we have here, we have starch, which can be found in 2 different forms. So starch can be in the form of amylose, which is pretty much a straight chain polysaccharide, or amylopectin, which is a very branching molecule. So amylose is what we use for our energy sources. Amylopectin is a little bit harder to break down, and if you've heard of pectin, if you've ever produced jam, pectin is a compound or a molecule that you can use to thicken fruit purees to produce jams and jellies. Glycogen over here is similar to starch. It is a storage molecule, but this is what animals produce in their livers and their muscles to store up sugar for later, but we'll talk about that when we talk more about glycogen. Starch is a long-term energy storage molecule in plants, and it's made of long branching chains of glucose, like I mentioned, and it tends to be stored in the roots and the stems of plants. So some good sources of starch would be, potatoes. So I've got some French fries there, some bread, some pasta. So grains and potatoes and root vegetables are really good sources of starch. And again, this is another representation of starch. Glycogen is an energy storage molecule found in animals. And when we have excess blood glucose after digesting and absorbing our nutrients, we store that excess blood glucose in the liver and the muscles in the form of glycogen. And our pancreas is involved in that by depositing the sugar with the help of insulin, a hormone that we'll learn about more when we talk about homeostasis. Cellulose is a third polysaccharide, the last one we'll talk about, and it's a structural polysaccharide. So starch and glycogen were both energy compounds, so they were storage molecules, so they store up energy for when plants need them later, if we're talking about starch, or glycogen for humans and other animals. When we've had too much glucose, we can store it for later use. And cellulose is totally different. It's a structural polysaccharide. So it helps support and hold up the molecule. So cellulose makes up the cell wall, and it's a straight chain polymer. So we can see here that there's all these straight chains of glucose molecules, and those chains are held together by hydrogen bonding between the molecules along those chains. And that forms structures called microfibrils. So you can see them forming microfibrils. Those intertwine to form fibers, and eventually you have this really rigid molecule that forms the cell wall. And that's what allows plants to, hold themselves up towards the sun. The thing about cellulose is that it's not digestible. So it's actually even though we can't digest it for energy, it is a very important component of our diets. It is what we call fiber. And if we don't have enough fiber in our diets, that can actually be bad for our health. Fiber is really good at absorbing water through our intestines to give bulk to our feces. Fiber also scrapes the walls of our intestines to kind of slough off any dead and dying cells. So it's really good at keeping our intestines clean. Some people would like to refer to it as the toothbrush of our intestines. So fiber is really important to our diet, and fiber is cellulose.